Hi YouTube, welcome back to my constant reader journey through the complete works of Stephen King, episode 12. Today we're reviewing The Eyes of the Dragon. I've got other worlds than these to talk about, so please remember to like, subscribe, comment, and you'll be the first to know when I'm on to the next Stephen King book. But let's talk about this one. This book, The Eyes of the Dragon, is the definition of polarizing. There will be readers who think that it's a genius reinvention for King, but there will be other more sort of stuffy readers who can't cope with how unquintessentially Stephen King this story is, because it's not a horror. It's just not. The Eyes of the Dragon is a high fantasy medieval epic, and I love it. Sure, we all like scary Stephen King, but you can't deny that he has a knack for world building, and that's a skill that lends itself well to the fantasy genre. Now, originally, Stephen King came up with this story for his daughter, Naomi, and I think she was probably a bit tired of having this famous writer for a father when she was too young to read any of his more disturbing bestsellers. So one day she was like, "Dad, please write me a book that's not a horror, something I can enjoy." And thus, The Eyes of the Dragon was born. And what I really appreciate is that he wrote a book for kids that adults can still enjoy. A lot of kids' book writers, especially these days, they cop out and they write some really basic material, knowing that a child will just eat it up regardless. And I think it speaks volumes about the kind of writer that Stephen King is, that he didn't half-ass this project. He wanted to make a book that could be appreciated by any age. And I think personally, he achieved that. He has created a story that you can have a good time with. It's a fairy tale, not to be confused with his 2022 novel, Fairy Tale, but what I mean is that it's a classic battle between the forces of good and evil. Tale as old as time. This story is not trying to be subversive or reinvent fantasy. It embodies that medieval archetype. It delivers a solid attempt in the process. The first limited edition copies of Eyes of the Dragon were published as early as 1984, but it didn't actually achieve mass market status until 1987, so that's considered by some to be its official year it was published. This is why I find it so strange that upon release of The Eyes of the Dragon, it faced so much backlash from the fandom, because people who had followed King's career since the early 70s, they felt betrayed that instead of his usual horror, he released what they saw as like a basic kids book, which, by the way, is so rude, so reductive. But also, at this point, King had already released The Gunslinger, the first instalment in the Dark Tower series. So true fans should have already anticipated that fantasy writing was in his repertoire, because he'd already written one. More professional critics actually praise The Eyes of the Dragon. It's a perfectly well-written, creative departure for someone who, is happy with the horror label, but has other things as well that they want to write about. What's so crazy as well about these fans is their reaction to The Eyes of the Dragon is what inspired King to write Misery, one of his most celebrated works to date. The story of Annie Wilkes saving her favourite writer, only to then keep him hostage and demand that he only writes in a particular way. It's such a perfect response to this new relationship that King found himself in with these, crazy stalker fans over this one book. So even if you don't like Eyes of the Dragon, it gave birth to a fan favourite in his collection. Everybody loves Misery. But we're not here to talk about Misery, we're here to talk about The Eyes of the Dragon. It's set in the kingdom of Delain. Our 5 main characters are King Roland, Queen Sasha, their 2 sons, Peter and Thomas, and the king's main advisor, the wicked magician Flag. Our third-person narrator is your typical omniscient storyteller who knows the story inside out and is introducing us to each of their characters, developing the backstories of them. We'll start with King Roland. He has ruled Delain for a while, but he's very old, he's a very weak man. Most of his decisions are influenced by his wife Sasha, or his main advisor / magician, Flag. Flag is a chaotic entity who you might have already encountered. He shows up in The Stand and the Dark Tower series, or so I'm told. I haven't actually read either of those yet, but I look forward to. he reappears every few centuries in this story as like a demonic entity under a guise. He's all about bringing chaos to the kingdom. He's like a typical trickster or force for evil. He's, he's got a two-headed parrot. He's wacky. Roland, I really don't like that name. It doesn't sound very royal. In an uncharacteristic moment of bravery, he slays a dragon on a hunting trip, and when he goes home to his wife, they conceive their first son, Peter. Years later, they have their second son, Thomas, and I think you can tell where this is going. It's a classic, two brothers contrast. Peter is noble, heroic, the older brother. Thomas isn't evil, but he's embittered by the reality of living in his older brother's greatness, like living in the shadow of it. This trope comes up a lot in Stephen King books. I mean, he is the younger brother to David King, so I wonder if it's the case of art imitating life. Does he resent his older brother? I don't know. As someone who grew up as the younger of two brothers, there are moments where it can be tough. You walk around sometimes with this chip on your shoulder. So I do naturally gravitate to this type of character, such as Thomas, and I think King does as well. Flagg knows that Roland will die soon, so he wants to get under Peter's skin so that when he succeeds to the throne, he can manipulate him. Peter is not very silly. He knows that Flagg is bad news, and so Flagg has to switch gears and target Thomas, while killing the Queen Sasha and Peter in the process, or at least getting them out of the way. The Queen especially has been very disruptive in Flagg's plans. She gets Peter this giant dollhouse that might come up later, and the King refuses to get rid of it when Flagg insists. So now he knows Sasha has got to go. And he creates this poison, but then decides against it because he knows that it will be too obvious. So instead he strikes a deal with the midwife who delivered Peter. She saves the life of Sasha's second son, but then kills Sasha while delivering Thomas by like a seemingly accidental bleed. It's very twisted, very evil. And it's a shame because Sasha seemed like a cool character. She was a very loving mother. She has this tender moment with Peter where she talks about being king as a balancing act between acting like a god and acting like a dog. And she tells him off for not using a napkin at dinner, which again comes up later. He never forgets that lesson. Thomas, on the other hand, never got to meet his mum, so he especially pines for his dad's affections, which seem to be unfairly focused on Peter as the heir. Peter has his mother's strong will. He saves a wounded horse from being killed and wins a three-legged race with his best friend, Ben Stard. Is that how you say it? Ben Stard? Ben Stade? I don't know. I do find it odd that while Ben comes up later, the horse that he saves, he names it Peony. We never see it again. It was strange, or at least I thought it was. But meanwhile, Thomas, he overhears his father laughing about him, so he takes his anger out on a sick dog in the streets. Flagg witnesses this cruelty and knows he can use this to his advantage. Flagg then comes up with a deadly poison that's called dragon sand. He found it beyond the kingdom of Delain, so none of the physicians will recognise it. The king has a drink of wine with it in, and it's easy to frame Peter because Peter's normally there with him, and so the drink is spiked with the poison. What I fundamentally don't get is why he went to the effort of showing Thomas the secret passageway. So if you were wondering what the title is referring to, the eyes of the dragon are the eyes of Nina. So the dragon that Roland killed on the hunting trip, he hung its head on the wall in his trophy room. And Flagg shows Thomas how the head has been hollowed out, and if you go through this secret passageway, the fourth brick up from the one with a chip in it, there's a secret tunnel that goes into the head of the dragon. So anybody can watch the king through this secret area, through the tinted glass, the eyes of the dragon. Flagg tells Thomas about this passageway in confidence. Maybe so Thomas will put more trust in Flagg when he becomes king. But this also means that he's now a witness to the murder, which does come up later. So it does feel odd on Flagg's part. especially when he gets obsessed with spying on his dad. I'm kind of surprised that Flagg didn't use like a spell to seal off the passageway so that nobody would be able to witness the act of the poisoning. Maybe he wanted Thomas to see, maybe that's more sadistic, I don't know. But the poison works. It's in the morning, King Roland, he's no longer alive, his final hours are spent in agony, he's fuming smoke, spitting fire like a dragon. The people of Delaine search everywhere for his killer until Peter's butler finds a piece of incriminating evidence that was of course planted there by Flagg to frame him for the murder. So instead of Peter being coronated as the new king, Thomas becomes the new king, and Peter is imprisoned in the Needle, which is the tallest tower in the kingdom. He awaits trial for the killing of his father. Flagg is sort of clapping his hands together. He's got everything he's wanted. Peter's incarcerated. Thomas is the new king. He can easily manipulate him. I was quite surprised by how simple the plot gets at this point. Like, from a fantasy POV, I expected an adventure novel, but we never really leave the kingdom. And from this point onwards, the book turns into like medieval Shawshank Redemption. Peter is essentially Andy Dufresne. He's in prison for years on a crime that he didn't commit. He doesn't, however, chip away at his cell wall. One, because he doesn't have a poster of Rita Hayworth, and two, his cell is over 300 feet in the air. So instead, Peter has requested 2 creature comforts in his cell, the dollhouse that his mother gifted him, and the royal napkins with their seals removed for every meal. The judge, Anders Paynor, he knows how close Peter was with his mum, so he does let him have these things, not realising that they will become instrumental in his escape plan, even though that's quite obvious to the reader. Over the course of 5 years, Peter takes the miniature loom in the dollhouse and weaves together like the fibres from the napkins to fashion an escape rope. It's remarkable how careless Flagg is during these 5 years. Like, he's a terrible villain. He doesn't once check up on Peter until literally the day that he plans to make his escape. I suppose it's meant to be a case of villain's hubris, where he's so confident he doesn't feel that he needs to worry about this. But it's so crazy to me how for like over 100 pages, Flagg just disappears from the story. Peter finds a locket in the cell that again ties Flagg to the murder of someone hundreds of years ago for the exact same framing of a crime. The kingdom is sort of turning against Thomas because he's a bad ruler. He's raising taxes at the request of Flagg, gearing towards creating conflict and mischief throughout this kingdom. Thomas as well is dealing with the guilt of knowing that his brother didn't kill Roland because he saw Flagg put the poison in through the eyes of the dragon. But he doesn't want to give away the opportunity to be the successful brother for a change. So Thomas spends most of his time excessively drinking. He sleepwalks into the secret passageway where his personal butler Dennis overhears his confession that he witnessed Flagg poison Roland. And so he works with Paynor and Ben to free Peter and see Flagg come to justice. Now, Stephen King's daughter, as I said earlier, was the one who requested this story, and she even gets her own character. Naomi is a peasant girl who leads the resistance group. She has her own pack of husky-esque dogs. You can tell that King really wanted to make a cool character for his daughter to relate to. And I think he was successful in that respect, although she could have come into the story much earlier. And she's only sort of tertiary in the great scheme of things. I wish she'd had more of like a point to her. Give her more sort of feminist girl boss moments. The final act happens so quickly. I'll try and explain as best as I can. Dennis contacts Peter in secret. He finds out that he's escaping that night with the rope that he's made. Flagg suspects something, so he looks into his magic crystal and he sees that Peter is trying to escape. So Flagg just goes full demon. He flies up the hundreds of stairs to the cell. He's swinging this giant axe. When he reaches the top, Peter's already jumped out the window. So he doesn't do anything, thinking that he'll die from the fall because his rope isn't long enough and it's going to snap. But what he doesn't account for is that Dennis, Ben and Naomi have taken all the napkins and they've fashioned them into this sort of soft bed that he crash lands on to cushion his fall. The group then escape Flag by running into the castle. Peter goes to his dad's living room to get the same enchanted bow and arrow that Roland used to kill Nina. Remember, that's the dragon on the wall. Flag is hot on their tails. He doesn't anticipate that Thomas is already in the room with the bow and arrow. Flag tries to turn Thomas against Peter, but Peter brings up the locket and Thomas finally gets a backbone, I guess. Flag, enraged, just flies at Thomas, but Thomas shoots him in the eye. Flag poofs into thin air. He's disappeared from the kingdom. The kingdom is saved for now. And that's the story. Peter takes back the crown. Ben and Naomi get married. Thomas goes off with Dennis to search for Flag. They all live happily ever after. As someone who hasn't read The Dark Tower, I do hope that we revisit Thomas and Dennis in their travels to find Flag. That would be a fun homage to this story. But I must say, The Eyes of the Dragon is a really fun read. I mean, sure, it's a departure from the sort of stuff that he normally writes. And if you're a die-hard horror fan, you might not appreciate that. It's effectively a kid's book. But it's a great kid's book. Like, this is secretly what I wanted The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon to be like, because that's another story that's more juvenile in its approach. But this is not in a basic way, you know? Like, a young audience can enjoy this, but adults could read this as well. And even if you don't like this book, it's impossible to deny his versatility. Like, to think he wrote this around the same time as The Talisman, while also writing Thinner under the Bachman alias. Like, substance abuse aside, part of the reason he has cemented himself as a writing mainstay is because, more than anyone, he just puts so much effort into the craft, and he must be sitting on hundreds of unpublished gems. But yeah, that's The Eyes of the Dragon. If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and between you and me, the next few reviews will be on a different writer. He goes by the name of Richard Bachman. You might have heard of him.